Test, test. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Toni. I'm with the EF and also with the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And today, I'd like to present the topic, and you'll see that I'm very passionate about. So today's talk will be about blockchain privacy. And in specific, we're going to talk about stealth addresses. So just for those who don't know me, so I've done some hobbyish projects like mfboost.pix and tornadowarning.info, and also doing research at EF. But today's talk is actually a little different. So today I want to present an ERC 5564 to you, which is stealth addresses. So just to give you a rough outline what I'm going to talk about, the first part will define the problem. So we will talk about which problem do we try to solve with stealth addresses. Then I'd like to quickly introduce you how stealth addresses work, which is a little math, but I try to keep it very simple and short. And last but not least, I try to cover some use cases and also mention why we need an ERC for stealth addresses and what's the purpose of standardizing them. So let's directly jump into the problem definition. So what you can see here is we have two entities. We have A and B, Alice and Bob. And Alice has some money that she wants to transfer to Bob. So far, so simple. The problem is they're using a public blockchain. And as we know, everything is public, so everyone can see their interaction between Alice and Bob. Of course, Alice cares a lot about privacy, and she doesn't want to let everyone in the world know that she has some connection with Bob. So Alice tries to avoid the link between her and Bob. So what she could do is very simple. She could just reach out to Bob and say, hey Bob, I don't want to transfer the funds to your publicly known address that is already doxed. Please generate a new address and I will use that for our transfer. Bob would probably be like, yeah, sure, let's do that. And in the end, what they achieve is like, Alice can just send the funds to the new address that Bob just generated, which is in this case address C. And what they got is they didn't create a link between A and B, so they create a link between A and C. So the world would still see that Alice sent some funds, but they would not know that it's Bob. The problem here is, at some point, Bob would be like, okay, that was quite smooth, but wouldn't it be even smoother if we could do that without having any prior interaction? And this is exactly the point where both of them might at some point discover stealth addresses. So what stealth addresses allow Alice to do is to generate an address in the name of Bob, knowing that only Bob will be able to generate the private key to that address. So without any prior interaction, Alice can generate an address for Bob, send funds to that address, and knowing that only Bob can access those funds in the end. So there's no interaction in between them, and for everyone else, it will simply look like if Alice just sent the funds to some random address. In the end, what they achieve by doing that is unlinkability. So there are two properties, or maybe three properties, but we will focus on two, which is untraceability and unlinkability. So untraceability always requires some mixing. Some mixing like we know from Tornado Cash or from coin joins on Bitcoin. And stealth addresses will only provide you unlinkability. So what you get is you cannot link the sender to the recipient, but there's no mixing involved. So in the end, there is no connection between Alice and Bob, but only between Alice and some new address, some never used address. And this could even be Alice herself, right? Maybe Alice just set up a new wallet and transferred the funds to a new address. So that's more or less the concept behind stealth addresses. And now I'd like to quickly show you how that works. Let's walk you through an example. So what you can see here is, again, Alice and Bob, and both of them have access to a key pair. So the lowercase letters are the private keys, and the uppercase letters are the public keys. So Bob has access to his known key pair, which is doxed, so it's probably bob.eth or something. And Alice has an ephemeral key pair. This is important. So Alice's key pair is just randomly generated and is not her real key pair. So Bob uses his own key pair and Alice just randomly generates a new key pair. So the first step is for Alice to generate a stealth address for Bob would be to get Bob's public key. So the public key is by nature public, so Alice can just take Bob's public key, and then she does the following. So the first step is Alice generates a shared secret, here denoted as the lowercase letter s. So Alice takes her own ephemeral private key. Just to recall, it was randomly generated. So Alice takes the private key and multiplies it with the public key of Bob to generate the shared secret. Then she hashes the shared secret, and from that hash, she derives again an elliptic curve point. She does so by multiplying the hash shared secret, which you can see in the third row. She multiplies the hash shared secret with the generator point of the elliptic curve, and then she adds Bob's public key again to it. So what she gets when she multiplies the hash shared secret to the generator point is an elliptic curve point, and then she can just do an elliptic curve addition and adds Bob's public key to it. And finally, the outcome would be a stealth public key, and she can just use the normal way, the traditional way, to turn public keys into ephemeral addresses. So she can just use that stealth public key to generate the stealth address. So at this point, Alice has generated a stealth address for Bob without any interaction with Bob yet. The next step for Alice would be to send the funds to the stealth address. So Alice sends the funds to the stealth address, and in the same transaction, Alice publishes her ephemeral public, the ephemeral public key. So the ephemeral public key is just the public key that was generated from the randomly generated private key. So Alice puts the ephemeral public key on chain, and at this point, Bob can essentially start with finding his own stealth address. So what Bob would do is, he would engage in some parsing. So Bob would need to go through all the ephemeral public keys that have ever been published and look over all these public keys and check maybe one of these public keys can be used to find his own stealth address. And this works like the following. So Bob has then a list of all the ephemeral public keys that have ever been published, which is here denoted as ABC, the uppercase letters. And Bob would then loop over all these ephemeral public keys and tries the following. So he tries to multiply all of them with his private key, then hashes the result, essentially does the same as Alice did, multiplies it again by the generator point, and adds his own public key to it. And at this point, if the transaction was really supposed to go to Bob, so if Alice used Bob's public key together with the ephemeral private key, then Bob will be able to find his own stealth address. And this is essentially possible because more or less, if you calculate the shared secret here and the shared secret here with the right ephemeral public key, then they will both arrive at the same shared secret. So in the end, Bob derives the same stealth address as Alice, and if he finds a stealth address that has funds on it, he knows he will be able to access that address and spend those funds. And now the coolest thing here is the last line on the right side, because how would Bob then access the funds? Bob would be able to access the funds by taking his own private key and adding it to the hashed shared secret. So this is a normal addition, and Bob would just add his own private key to the hashed shared secret, and the outcome would be the private key that can finally access the stealth address. That's essentially how stealth addresses work. And this equation, for those very interested in it, so this is the equation that makes everything possible. So what this equation says is we have the hash shared secret. We can take it times the generator point of the elliptic curve and add the public key, which is essentially the same as first adding the two integers, which are Bob's private key on the right side and the hash shared secret, and then multiplying that by the generator point. And because this equation holds true, the whole thing will work. Then, of course, this is not very handy as of now because Bob needs to do some parsing, and the parsing can be, it can be very hard, especially when there are many ephemeral public keys involved. So what we do now is we split up the key pair that Bob owns into two key pairs. So Bob previously had one key pair, his private, consisting of his private key and his public key, and now Bob has two key pairs, which is a spending and a scanning key. And the cool thing here is now, Bob can now outsource the parsing. The parsing is always not something that we want to let users do, but now Bob can just give out his scanning private key and outsource the parsing process, which means Bob can give, for example, the private key, so the scanning private key to some party, to some exchange, and this exchange could then find the stealth addresses for Bob, but would not be able to spend from that stealth address. This is very important. So what we get by equipping Bob with two key pairs is the feature that Bob can give away his scanning private key while still remaining full control of his actual funds on the stealth address. This, some of you might be reminded from the CryptoNode white paper from 13, which proposed essentially that for stealth addresses. So just equipping the recipient with two key pairs allows us to outsource the parsing. Right, so that was enough elliptic curve math for now. Let me quickly tell you why we need some standardization, so why there is even some an ERC required for stealth addresses. The problem with stealth addresses is that not every stealth address protocol is equal to another stealth address protocol. So you can use many different ways to generate stealth addresses. You can use the SEC 256K1 curve, the R1 curve. There are stealth address protocols being proposed using elliptic curve pairings. And then even more sophisticated ways, you can even use lattice-based cryptography to generate stealth addresses. And because the recipient needs to know how the sender generated the stealth address, we need some standardization. Because otherwise the recipient would not know which exact stealth address protocol was used by the sender. So maybe the sender used SEC 256K1, maybe the sender used a stealth address protocol based on elliptic curve pairings, and the recipient would more or less have to go through every possible protocol to find his stealth address. Just to give you a rough sense of how many stealth address protocols there were proposed, this was just a selection of some papers I found very interesting, and there you find stealth address protocols being proposed using the standard SEC 256K1 curve. There were stealth address protocols based on lattice-based cryptography, but also elliptic curve pairings. So academia found many different ways, many improvements for stealth address protocols, and hasn't stopped. So at some point, when we want to implement stealth addresses, we need some standard way to let the recipient know how the stealth address was generated on the sender's side. Because, just to recall, there's no interaction. So what ERC 5564 is now proposing is a common basement, for more or less, that allows different stealth address protocols to be built on top of the foundation. So ERC 5564 proposes a simple smart contract that is then used to announce, to broadcast the ephemeral public key, which is essentially the information that the recipient needs to find his stealth address and to finally access the stealth address. And in the end, standardization is key in this sense, because otherwise the recipient would never know which exact stealth address protocol that was used. For those knowing Solidity, you can see the contract here on the left-hand side. It's essentially a very simple smart contract that only consists of an event and a function, and the function lets you do nothing else than emitting the event. So we have the function that can then be called by everyone to, during the stealth address transfer, and letting the recipient know exactly which stealth address protocol that was used. And we do so by using a shim ID. So in the shim ID, we specify which exact protocol that was used. For example, shim ID number 1 could be the SEC 256K1 curve. Shim ID number 2 could be some lattice-based cryptography stealth address protocol. Then there are some additional parameters in that event. You can see we have the stealth address itself in the event. This is very handy to not force the recipient to do any additional RPC calls. Then there is the caller in the event, which is just used to have some anti-DOS attack filtering enabled, because of course you load some computations over to the recipient side which are not priced in with gas, right? So we are open for DOS attacks, but they can easily be filtered on the recipient side, and that's why we include the caller. Then there is the ephemeral public key. That's essentially the very important information required on the recipient side to find the stealth address, and then also to derive the private key to the stealth address. And then some metadata, which is just very handy to allow the recipient directly to get some additional information for which token was transferred, or if there was a special method like an approval executed. ERC 5564 also comes with its own address scheme, which consists more or less of 2 public keys in compressed form. So as I said, the recipient has 2 public keys. So we use these 2 public keys, we just concatenate them, and then we put them into one address format to allow senders a simpler way to send to a stealth address. There would also be another ESC, a follow-up one, which just proposes a stealth address registry where users can register their stealth addresses, and then it make it more easy for the recipient, for senders to find the stealth meta address, which is the one to generate the stealth addresses from for the recipient. Finally, very quickly, what stealth addresses can be used for. Stealth addresses are very handy to be used for donations. Sometimes you want to secure the person you're donating to, because maybe you don't want to create a connection to the person you're donating to, or vice versa. Maybe the person receiving the donation doesn't want to have a connection to the person's donating to this one. Payroll checks, private messaging, and so on. So there are many different use cases where stealth addresses can be very handy. Finally, find some additional information on the links provided here on the slide. So there is a proof of concept implemented on stealth-wallet.xyz. You can find the ERCs in the EAP repo, and also you can write, there's also a paper, so we wrote an academic paper which is called Base SAP, so the base for stealth address protocols. You can find the academic paper, which also describes all the stuff I just told you, very, very detailed. And also feel free to reach out to me if you have any additional questions, or especially if you're building a wallet or something and you want to implement stealth addresses in your wallet. I'm very happy to help you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, we don't have time, so feel free to have the question outside of the room.
Perfect. Yeah, just reach out to me if you have any questions.